Hello and welcome to Premier Unbelievable, the show that brings thinkers, Christians, skeptics and all those in between into friendly dialogue about the biggest questions in life, faith and theology. I'm John Nelson, and in today's show we are going to be discussing Christian approaches to violence. In a world marred by war, what is the Christian response to pacifism, and can a war ever be just? To help us wrestle with these questions, we have two thoughtful Christian writers and theologians. Our first guest on the show is Brian Zahnd, the founder and leading pastor of Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. Brian is the well-known author of now 12 books, including Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God and Farewell to Mars, an evangelical pastor's journey towards the biblical gospel of peace. Brian is a really compelling writer. His posts and his notes are always popping up on my Substack, which is another great place to follow his work. Brian, it's really wonderful to have you joining us on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you. Joining Brian in this discussion is Hronich, a theologian who studied at Princeton and is currently completing his doctoral studies at the University of St. Andrews. Andrew is the author of Once Loved, Always Loved, a book defending Christian universalism and the reconciliation of all things to God. Andrew, I hope you found a warm spot to tune in from chilly St. Andrews. Thank you for joining the discussion today.
Thank you for having me.
I really want in this first part of our discussion to get into the biblical witness and to think about the person of Jesus and his response to violence. But before we do that, Brian, you talk in your book, A Farewell to Mars, about your own journey with this topic of violence and war. So I was just wondering, just kicking off, whether you could explain some of your own journey towards what you call this biblical gospel of peace.
The subtitle is not mine. That's the publisher's. I probably wouldn't have described it like that. But my journey is rather long because I'm getting old. I have pastored one church for now 44 years.
Wow.
But I came into the faith through the Jesus movement. That kind of led me into the charismatic movement because that's the way it happened. And then I found myself kind of just in the general milieu of American evangelicalism, although I never really self-identified as an evangelical. But if you're in that world, you will not find a more supportive religious group for the American war enterprise than American evangelical Christians. And so I just sort of assumed that, although I didn't begin that way. As a Jesus freak from the 70s, I read the Sermon on the Mount when I was 16 and understood what it meant. And then I got taught. And so I just sort of fell into the idea that what Christians in America did was support the American war machine, because you don't ask questions when God's on your side. And that continued all the way up until the 21st century when I had a dramatic, almost a mystical experience of, and I won't tell the whole story now, but I do tell it in the book. In fact, the book begins with that, where I saw myself through the eyes of Christ and being almost gleeful in my support of the first Gulf War. And that began to change everything. And I was just forced to rethink everything and to take Jesus seriously about how he, and I would also say the early church, meaning the pre-Constantine church, what their attitudes and position towards war was. And maybe I'll just say one more thing and then I'll step aside here. But because this is going to come up, I just want to get it out of the way. I do not describe myself as a pacifist. Pacifism is a ethical position regarding violence that anyone can adopt apart from Christ, and many have done so. I may find that admirable. It just doesn't describe me. I mean, just left to myself, I can be one who relishes a certain amount of violence. What I do claim to be is a Christian. And then we have the discussion about how Christ informs us regarding violence. And I think that's probably what this program is about. So I think it's honest for me to say I'm not a pacifist, but I'm a Christian. The other reason I say that is once someone says, well, I'm a pacifist, the response generally is to be very dismissive. Oh, well, of course, you're one of those exotic things, and the conversation ends. So, no, I'm not a pacifist. I am a Christian. Let's have the conversation on how Christ informs us concerning violence, especially war.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And Andrew, I mean, how did you come to be interested in this whole theological concept of a just war?
Yeah, well, it actually goes back to my early childhood. I've always been an avid reader. I didn't mean for this to be in the frame, but people can see I got maybe a couple dozen books back there. But I grew up very young. We had library day in my family, and we'd go to the library and I'd read. And from an early age, I was drawn to history. And unfortunately, a great deal of history has been war. And I read tons and tons and tons of books on war from a very young age, and very fascinated by different individual figures, different battle tactics, all of that. Now, it was only when I started to mature and I started to develop my own, sense of a moral system that I started to ask questions about war and violence wholesale. I used to actually, when I was a little kid, people want to pursue different careers. I actually wanted to go into the military. I was a very patriotic little kid, and I thought I had family members who served in the military. I had friends from church who were in the Marine Corps, and I thought that it would be a good and noble thing to be willing to put my life on the line to defend my loved ones. And that's what I thought as a little kid. Then I had some misgivings as I looked into things regarding the Bush administration. I wasn't the biggest fan growing up. And I was reminded of Alistair McIntyre, who once said that dying for your country can be like dying for the electric power company. So I was disabused of that as I got older. And then I returned to interest a couple years ago in just war and pacifism when I met people from Black churches. And we talked about the history of colonization and the history of slavery. And I had one professor who we were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. versus other individuals' approaches to violence. And she said that she was always cognizant of the fact that her freedom came from a war in this country, in America.
Yeah.
That her freedom was the product of a war. And I met other individuals who were from Latin America and who had a lot of animosity for former conquistadors. And they were very antagonistic towards my notions of pacifism. And so that's when I kind of began to rethink a lot of that. So yeah, it's been a journey for me as well.
That's fascinating. I do want to return in a moment to this concept of freedom, but for now, let's focus on this biblical witness, because when we turn to the Bible, it seems like we've just got this baffling range of views on violence. We obviously have Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek. We have Paul saying, submit to the authorities of your rulers. We have all of those crusades or moments in the Old Testament where violence seems to not only be condoned but sort of actively commanded by God. So, Brian, I know you wouldn't necessarily embrace the pacifist label, but when you read through the Gospels, what do you see as God's position on war and violence?
I see that Jesus is proclaiming and enacting the kingdom of God. I think I can say everything Jesus did or said was in one way or another an announcement or an enactment of the kingdom of God. And then I would say this kingdom is the alternative to the kingdoms of this world, which are all formed through war. I mean, if you look at the boundaries of nations, there is a story of war that lies behind every one of them. And when Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate's only interested in one thing, does he claim to be a king? And Jesus says, yes, he is a king, but it's not a kingdom that you can understand. It's not from this world. It's for this world, but it's not from this world. In other words, it doesn't come by the way of war. It doesn't come by the way of the pharaohs and the Caesars. He said, if my kingdom was from this world, my servants would be fighting. And they were ready to fight, by the way. We know that story from Gethsemane with with Peter, but Jesus, what does he do? He says, no more of this. I forgot which church father it was. It might have been Tertullian, but it might have been someone else. Said, when Christ disarmed Peter, he disarmed all soldiers. And so, and whether or not we will agree that this is what should be, I think Andrew has to be honest that this was the position of the early church. By the vast majority of the church fathers just saw the participation in war as just incompatible with how they understood to follow Christ. Now, the conversation is reframed after you have a so-called Christian emperor. So that's my initial response.
And so the Christian emperor you're referring to is Constantine, and he famously could not get baptized until he was on his deathbed, though he might have sort of seen himself as a follower of Jesus.
I think it's a moment of him acknowledging that you really can't be an emperor, and a Christian at the same time. And so, contrary to what was the practice of the time, he waited till the very end to then be baptized. I think he was always living in that tension of, can I really be a Christian and also be running an empire at the same time?
Yeah. So, Andrew, we find, some quite radical teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. We have, do not resist an evildoer, love your enemies, blessed are the peacemakers. And these seem like quite radical injunctions against violence. So is it to depart from these teachings to take the view that war is sometimes permissible or violence is sometimes permissible?
No, yes, it's a great question, and I would like to situate this within the whole biblical narrative context, right? I'm somebody who's drawn to thinkers like Oliver O'Donovan, right? That we have to take the whole into perspective, that we are people who live between the times, or proleptically, the age to come is manifest now, but we still live in that tension. Some people, they find it uncomfortable that war is an element we see throughout most of the Bible. If you start in the very beginning with Adam, we see the instruction that Adam is given, the priestly and royal instruction to tend and to guard or to keep the garden, and he failed in that task. We see elsewhere that God himself is described as a man of war. We have Tremper Longman has a whole book about this. This was constant image of God that comes up, that he is a man of war. David says in 1 Samuel that his hands are trained for war by God, right? So we have this this image of God as a warrior but I think that Pastor Brian and I, we might want to contextualize that differently in our hermeneutical structures, right? But we see this general notion carried throughout. I think with the church today, we need to understand that the church is not advanced by the sword that is given to the temporal rulers, but the sword of the Spirit. We have the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and we actualize those keys in the proclamation of the gospel and the good works that the Holy Spirit works through us, right? That's how we draw people in. So there's a difference between the church gathered, I would say, and the church scattered, right? There are certain things that the church gathered can do that the church scattered cannot do. For example, conjugal rights, that is something that a Christian can do towards the Christian spouse, but that is not something that the church wholesale can do. And likewise, the church wholesale can do things that the individual Christian cannot, such as excommunication, right? So I don't think that war is something that the church can advance. And this is a novel development within the just war tradition, because if you look back, you had people who thought that this would be the case, that you could advance parochial Christian interests against maybe Protestants if you're the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Or if you're Spanish conquistadors, that you evangelize people by means of the sword. It's ridiculous if you read people like Bartholomew de las Casas, right? How the gospel was weaponized against people. It's disgusting. Now, as far as Jesus, I think Pastor Brian and I might see these texts differently. But I think the Sermon on the Mount still does have instructions that rulers ought to take into account. And I think a good book that examines this would be Defending Constantine by Peter Leithart. I wrote an essay that engages
I debated Peter Leithart on that book.
Oh, did you really? I'll have to check that out. His son was actually my professor when I was a kid. So there's that connection there. But I would agree with people like Tremper Longman and Peter Leithart that when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, for example, this is a tolerable abuse. This is what we see as an act of contempt, and that's tolerable, right? That's different than me turning the cheek of somebody else, namely somebody who's undergoing genocide or ethnic cleansing, perhaps. I'd be a little bit more wary to turn their cheek. I don't think that's as much a tolerable abuse as contempt, a backhanded insult. Jesus in John 18, he tells Peter, he doesn't say, throw away your sword, get rid of that. He said to sheath it, to put it back. Now, this is kind of strange, right? Why would he tell him, if Jesus was totally against violence per se, why would he tell him to just sheath it? Why not throw it away? I'm more the persuasion with Nigel Bigger.
I would say that Peter was wanting to employ that sword in the beginning of war. I'm not making an argument that Jesus said no one could have any kind of weapon for personal protection, including just from stray dogs. But Peter wants to launch the revolutionary war that will overthrow the Roman government and liberate Israel, and Jesus says no to that. So I want to keep this really within the context of war, just war, not can any person at any time, bear a weapon. I personally don't, but I don't think that's what Jesus is teaching there.
And I would agree with most of that. I think that Jesus wasn't willing to wage a private war for ethno-nationalist purposes, right? So he
wasn't willing to wage a war to liberate an occupied and oppressed people. That's what Israel was. Israel was an occupied nation, right? Oppressed by the Romans, and Jesus was unwilling to wage a war of liberation. And it's just, and that's what people expected him to do, including his own disciples, maybe including his mother and his brothers. That was the template for the Messiah. The Messiah comes, he follows in the footsteps of David and Judah Maccabee, and raises up an army, overthrows Pilate, maybe even marches on Rome itself, and installs himself as the new emperor. That's the expectation, the messianic expectation that Jesus refused to fulfill, and then instead subverts all of that by going to the cross. But we can't just say, well, okay, thank you, Jesus. I'm glad you did that for us. No, Jesus also, the central call of discipleship is take up your cross and follow me. Do it like I'm doing it.
Andrew, do you want a quick response to that?
No, yeah. So I would agree with Pastor Brian and with scholars like Dale Allison that Jesus wasn't willing to fit the mold of zealot-like people. So the zealots may have developed as a group later on than Jesus, but there were certainly prior elements that we can say, and Jesus wasn't willing to fit that mold. I would think this has to do with his placement within salvation history, and I'd be curious to hear what Pastor Brian thinks about. We see passages where John the Baptist, who's not Jesus, but John the Baptist in Luke 3:14, when soldiers approach him and tax collectors, he says to not extort individuals and to not ask higher than their wages. Now, some people, like Stanley Howard Watts and John Howard Yoder, they say that there's a difference between a police force and between an army. The problem is that this distinction wasn't as clear in those days, and that many of the individuals who were performing what we would consider to be policing duties were soldiers. They would also kill, execute people, and wage wars. So I don't think the distinction was as clear in those days as now.
Jesus was, I think Jesus is very central to your hermeneutic, Brian. You've said that Jesus is what God has to say. And so the fact that Jesus went to the cross willingly and did not resist is very crucial to this. Jesus was also a first century Jew. Each year he would have celebrated Passover and the liberation of God's liberation of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. And obviously what follows in the establishment of Israel is through violence and war. So how do you, if Jesus is what God has to say, how do you sort of reconcile that with the fact that it seems like Jesus probably would have thought that violence was sanctionable, at least in Israel's historic past?
Yeah. But Israel reaches its culmination in the single person who is the Christ. And Christ is crucified, buried, raised again, but then transformed. And so that now Israel occupies a new place in the world that is to be the image of Christ. But I want to go back to, I make a distinction between the waging of war and the functioning of a police force. And every civil society needs a police force that will periodically employ violence. But the two are very different. I mean, if in my city or your city, the police tonight employ lethal violence, there will be a full investigation. The officer will probably be put on temporary leave, and they'll investigate and make sure this was a proper use of force. That's nothing like war. What the early church said, and they understood, I mean, the apparatus of the military throughout the empire, I mean, they're also the engineers, they're building bridges, they are keeping the peace, and yes, also waging war. What the church said was, they didn't want the baptized, this is the early church, they didn't want the baptized to join the Roman legions, but they didn't require a Roman soldier who becomes a Christian to leave his position in the Roman legions. What they did require was a vow that they would not kill, even in combat. And so I know Andrew's given us some good book recommendations. I want to give one other than A Farewell to Mars. Alan Kreider's The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, which really, if you're going to read, and I have, if you're going to read Defending Constantine, I think you also then need to read The Patient Ferment of the Early Church by Alan Kreider. John, you're asking, though, a bigger question about, well, I mean, if you simply want to use the Old Testament as an endorsement for just war, well, then you also have to use it as an endorsement of unjust war. I mean, here's the thought experiment. Would you kill babies if God told you to? Because that's what you find in 1 Samuel 15. Allegedly, we have the prophet Samuel telling Saul to go kill the Amalekites, men, women, children, babies, for something they did centuries earlier. And so if your answer is yes, I will kill babies if God tells me to, well, then I don't have anything more to say. I've reached the end of being able to reason with you. So if you say, no, I'm not going to kill babies if God tells me to, although you can find that text in the scriptures, then your options are really limited. You can question the immutability of God. You can say, well, God used to do that, but he's not doing that anymore. I don't do that. I'm a traditional theist. I confess the immutability of God. God is not in the process of mutating and changing. He used to order the slaughter of babies, but now he's changed his mind. Some go there. I can't go there. Others question, this is more common, the morality of the whole issue. They'll say, well, ordinarily killing babies is, frowned upon. That'll land you in the Hague. But when God tells you to do it, then you can suspend the ethical, and then it's permitted. Well, that just leaves the door wide open to further atrocities that have happened through history. Whether you want to talk about the Mystic Massacre with the English colonists in Connecticut in the 1637 or whatever that year was, or the Crusades and things like that. I think the final option is you have to question how we read Scripture, how we understand it. I see the Old Testament as the inspired telling of Israel's story of coming to know the living God, but along the way, assumptions are made, and the story is not fully told until we reach Jesus Christ, who is the Word of God made flesh. What the Bible does infallibly is point us to Jesus, and what we cannot do is run back to the Old Testament, find a collection of verses, bring them, and use them as fodder to fight against what Jesus teaches concerning violence.
I want to give Andrew an opportunity to respond.
I came across a little heavy there. I just really want to have a delightful discussion with Andrew, whom I respect tremendously. But sometimes I get revved up. I don't want this to be a volatile debate. That's not in my heart.
Andrew, I want to give you a chance to respond to this idea that we can't be going to the Jewish scriptures and picking out passages and proof texting to make our argument for a just war. What do you make of what Brian has been saying?
So yeah, a couple of things. One, I would agree with Brian in that a lot of people, when they discuss just war, they just jump immediately to criteria, and it almost makes it sound like just war, this Platonic element that's up there in the heavens, where I think it needs to be situated contextually and historically, right? Like I don't actually talk about just war theory. I don't think that it's a theory. I prefer to talk about the just war tradition, or I even say justified war, because I don't think that war is intrinsically just. I mean, some people did, but that's just not true. And I think that there are developments within that tradition to the point where we could be speaking about distinct traditions, plural, right? Not just one tradition. So there's a lot of complexity there, and I just don't want to stultify that by conflating it and making it reductionistic. But going back to some things that Pastor Brian said, I mean, I've thought a lot about when it comes to violence too, not just the military, but also the police force. I think that our police force in America is very militarized, and I think that we need to roll that
Yes,
back.
that's a problem.
I think that we need alternative options. I don't think that violence is always the first result. I mean, there have been studies where people, they respond more positively to firemen as first responders than they do cops, right? And there are reasons behind that. Now, I have family members. I have lots of significant individuals in my life who are in law enforcement, and I want to respect them and have these conversations, but those are just my beliefs. I just think that it is too militarized in America, and there's just too hasty there's this assumption that violence can just solve all sorts of situations where there has to be more peaceful options. So I just want to say about the police force. Now, as far as I want to say another thing about Jesus, though. This would open up a whole can of worms, but Jesus' eschatology, how much does that factor in here? So Dale Allison, for example, he takes a distinct view from N.T. Wright. He might be somebody of the persuasion that Jesus thought that the end of the ages was coming in the lifetime of his listeners. So why carry around a shotgun, so to speak, if the atomic blast is about to go off? So why didn't Jesus incite, a national liberation movement? Because the end was just around the corner. Resurrection was going to be right there, right? So that's one thing is to keep in mind is people's framework of Jesus' eschatology and how this fits into this. Now, as far as Old Testament passages on violence, listen, I'm with Pastor Brian. I mean, his book, Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, came at a critical point in my life. I mean, individuals around me, they know how much that book impacted me. And I've recommended it to so many different people. It was a beautiful book, just like all of Pastor Brian's other books. I wish I could write that way. Unfortunately, I do not have that skillful ability. But I think that it is questionable, a lot of the passages that we read concerning the instructions that are given, like Pastor Brian says, we're talking about killing combatants, we're talking about ethnic cleansing, we're talking about genocide here. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. And I think that we need to take a different hermeneutical approach than certain other people are disposed to when interpreting these passages.
Yeah, let me respond. First of all, thank you for the kind words. I don't think Jesus was predicting the end of the world. He was predicting the end of the age, meaning the end of the temple age. The temple itself, the temple age, this temple apparatus and aristocracy, all that was coming to an end as it did. Now, I will grant that I think the early Christians, and I think you even see it in the New Testament, clearly expected the parousia, the appearing of Christ, the second coming, within their lifetime. And you say, okay, that was 2,000 years. Fine, so be it. I still think that's the way we should live. We are those upon whom the ends of the age have come. And I think we should live that way. I don't think we get to look back and say, well, Christ hasn't come back for 2,000 years, so maybe we should be waging wars. I would say we're all living in the last days. Everyone everywhere is always living in their last days. And so we are on the precipice of the return of Christ as far as we're concerned, and that we should live that way. Now, in talking about just war, there is the idea that, well, you can have rules, you can have laws within. Look, I'm all for the Geneva Convention. I'm just saying it mostly breaks down. Once the killing starts, the idea that we're going to and that's part of the issue I would raise. We can work from Augustine and his ideas about how war could be managed in a way that is still compatible with Christ-informed ethics in the 4th century, 5th century. I think, with modern warfare, I mean, in a nuclear age, in a time of almost unlimited capacity to kill, I don't know that the criteria for just war can be met. That's just how I think about it.
That's really interesting. I think it would be helpful, Andrew, if, you've talked about just war traditions. How do these originate with Augustine, someone I know you're studying? What were his criteria for going to war?
Yes. So Augustine, most scholars agree, would be borrowing certain elements prior that you'll find in Cicero and other pagan writers, and then adopting elements such as Christian charity to it and blending it together. So the Augustinian tradition has this reliance upon natural law as a teleological description. So we are created by God for a purpose, and we are sociable creatures. We seek community. And where does the state factor into that? Well, as that of ultimate responsibility for procuring the conditions and maintaining those conditions that are necessary for human flourishing. And so the state, according to the Augustinian view, would then be given the sword to safeguard those conditions for human flourishing. And just causes for war would be when there's occasions that threaten the tranquility of order, as Augustine would call it. Now, that's not what many people, I think, today view as good cause for war. Many people think today about national interest. You hear this all the time, disgusting, from people like Tucker Carlson, that even if there's genocide going on in certain countries, I mean, think of Rwanda, we shouldn't get involved. All right. And why's the reason why we shouldn't get involved? National interest, right? This is a very Machiavellian notion that we should remove war from any notion of moral discourse whatsoever other than language of national interest. And I think that is just a product of the Westphalian order. I have problems with nationalism. I have problems with how national identity in history has been procured. And I don't agree with the notion that we should only judge wars on the basis of national self-interest. Now, we have, as Pastor Brian has hinted at before, with the Geneva Convention and the rise of the liberal tradition, we have attempted to move beyond that. We have attempted to form multilateral treaties. We have attempted to form arms embargo. I'm all for limiting proliferation of nuclear weapons. I'm upset that in my country, we constantly talk about countries like North Korea and Iran getting nuclear weapons, but we weren't also ho-hum about India and Pakistan getting nuclear weapons. I mean, that should not have happened. And then right now, currently, we have a president talking about testing nuclear weapons. This should not happen. I mean, it should not happen at all. We should have protests in the streets against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And this reminds me of a professor I had at Princeton, George Hunsinger, who he would tell you that he is a pacifist, but he's deeply interested in just war. And why is that? Because of the moral hypocrisy of just war theorists, right? He wants them to be consistent. Another good book I could give you along these lines is by John Howard Yoder. And I have to preface, when I bring up Yoder, I am aware of all that has had in his past. This is not an endorsement of anything that he did in his personal life and all that. But the book itself is food for thought when war is unjust. And Yoder and other pacifists, listen, they're not just passive people. That's what I don't like the term. I find it unhelpful. It
sounds too much like the PASS rather than the Pacific as in peaceful.
Yeah. So I think that Yoder, he mentions about like 29 different versions of pacifists. And one of those is the one that Pastor Brian was describing before, which says that how in the world, this is where many Catholics fall, especially Catholic bishops, how in the world can we have a just war today? So I think even if you are a pacifist, you can be like my professor and you can hold just war folks to account and say, listen, according to the just war criteria, the war your country is waging is not just. Listen, according to the just war criteria, you yourself are at odds with it. And so I think that could be deeply helpful in these conversations.
I salute you, Andrew. I love that whole riff. That was great.
Am I right to think that there's a notion of proportionality as well baked into just war theory? So, I mean, the deployment of nuclear weapons would be a kind of egregious violation of that original sort of theological formulation of just war.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the many faults that I could list of the Protestant Reformation, that prior to the Protestant Reformation, it was actually very limited, the people that you could call upon for war. Right, the local populace, they were the rich of the country, in the sense that that's how you got your money, right, through tax revenues on their products and stuff. So when local armies would come in, they would try to leave them alone, because what's the point in burning down the whole country and taking over the stronghold if you just lost all those natural resources?
You had
And so you
certain
had
days when you couldn't wage war.
exactly, yep. You had the peace of God and the truce of God, which
Right.
attempted to impute spiritual status to certain days and certain individuals. The problem was that when the Protestant Reformation came to pass, certain of these individuals, such as pilgrims and penitents, they were no longer protected in that sense,
Yeah.
because Protestants thought that this was the salvation of works, right? And so they rolled it back. So that would be, and then you had, with the Enlightenment, you had this sense of nationalism in the French Revolution that led to mass mobilization, that leads to things like total war. And quite frankly, I think that we saw this all culminate together in World War II, which I would not classify as a just war wholesale, in the total war aspects and the atrocities that were committed. I think one of the biggest faults was unconditional surrender. The unconditional surrender led to 2 atomic bombs being dropped on Japan. We should
Yeah.
not have gone for unconditional surrender, and we saw the moral atrocities that happened because of that.
Again, we're on the same page with all of that. I think where we fundamentally differ is what is the role of the church within the world, and we may not even differ there. I would say it is not the task of the church to change the world. Our task is far more modest. It is simply to be that part of the world already transformed by Christ. When the church pursues power, it doesn't change the world, it becomes the world. Although I think, Andrew, you might even agree with that. I think where we're really differing is to what extent a Christian can participate in the apparatus of the military aspect of the state.
I don't think, when I talk about the mission of the church, right,
Yeah.
like I said before, I think it's helpful to distinguish, when we say church, do we mean just all believers throughout the ages wholesale, or do we mean the gathered church, right? The church scattered or the church gathered. I don't think it's the obligation of the church gathered to do what Pastor Brian said, to ally ourselves with coercive powers to force Christian identity in our countries. That's just not my opinion. Now, I would be interested, Pastor Brian, do you think that a Christian could participate in a peacekeeping UN effort to install a protectorate or a trusteeship in places like Sierra Leone or Liberia?
Yeah. Yeah, I see. I'm not going to say no, because I'm not going to get into drawing the lines. All right. I mean, for example, yes, I think a Christian can be a school teacher. Yes, I think a Christian can participate in the political process, even holding office. Yes, I think a Christian can be a policeman, and then you keep pushing it further and further. I don't want to draw a line and say, but here's where you can't go beyond. I just think here I think is the problem. Let's go to Romans. We all know about Romans 13. People do forget, though, that the guy that said, submit to the state was executed by the state. So I think here's the problem. Paul is aware of a revolutionary foment within that world, that the church, that his baptized believers could get drawn into. And I think what he's saying is, I do not want Christians participating in a violent revolution against Rome. I'm not. They have the state has its role. It maintains order and peace, and the criminals that we all agree are criminals will be punished by that. But then what we want to do is then we want to ask Paul, okay, yeah, at the end of Romans 12, it's you. And then when he goes into Romans 13, it's they. So Christians are to do good, and they are to respond to evil with good. But then he talks about the sword and the state and the Roman Empire and how our response to that would be. But we want to follow up and ask Paul this question. Yeah, but what happens when Christians end up in control of the government? I think Paul would say, that could never happen. And we say, I got a funny story to tell you. And I don't think the New Testament has any vision of Christians holding any serious political power within this world. That the early church really viewed itself as almost entirely otherworldly. And that we were salt and we were light, but we were not in a position to directly control the levers of power. And so I think that's part of I think our problem is we have arrived at a state that the New Testament doesn't really envision. And so that's why I think political theology is always tricky. And whenever I hear myself, and I'm invited to do a lot of these discussions, but every time I hear myself doing public political theology, I think, I think I agree with that, but I'm not sure. And so if I say something in the realm of political theology and you disagree, there's a chance that I disagree with it, because I think it's a very difficult place we're in. But my default is, I'm thinking right now of a recent book by John Dominic Crossan, where I can't remember the name of the book even. It's probably his most recent one. I don't know. Where he contrasts the vision of Luke, how the church might be involved with the state, and John the Revelator. And they're worlds apart. If you read Luke Acts, you find that Luke is at pains. He will cast every Roman in a positive light because he wants the church to be able to function and get along with it. He can't even bring himself to tell you, and then they cut off his head at the end of Acts. He just leaves it. He just continued in Rome unhindered until they cut off his head, but he won't say that. John the Revelator, though, on the other hand, the whole thing is it's a beast. It's a beast. And to cooperate with the beast is nothing more than making yourself in line with the harlot who rides the back of the beast. And that tension is even within the New Testament. I would say that I tend to drift toward a little bit John the Revelator. That's all Babylon. It's a beast. I don't want to get messed up with it. Come out of her, my people. But I do understand that is not the only witness we have in the New Testament about how to relate to the principalities and powers.
I'll let Andrew respond in just a moment, but I was thinking, if we have these sort of competing visions, then is the just war tradition not sort of a nice compromise? It's looking at a state in which Christians are part of the world, part of the government, but it's not necessarily baptizing it, but it's saying, if we are to commit violence, let us go about this in a way that is more faithful to the scriptures.
I'm not going to embrace just war theory, but I hope that millions do.
Andrew, how would you like to respond?
No, yeah, there's a lot there. And I would agree with Brian that there are many political theologians who will often they'll compare Romans 13 and Revelation 13. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So what I would say is, I don't think that the scriptural testimony wholesale is that every government is a beast. For example, if we read Isaiah, we have Cyrus referred to as a Messiah. If we read Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar is called God's servant. If you read Romans 13, you have God's, some people vicar, some people servant. But if you read Revelation 13, you have a beast, right? Now, I think, again, everything is contextual. And liberal democracies are not the same thing as these authoritarian regimes in the past. For example, John F. Kennedy once said that in America, we all hold office, right? We have citizenship. Not everybody in the Roman Empire during the time of Paul had citizenship. And as citizens in this country, we were afforded certain rights and privileges that they were just not. And the government has certain duties and obligations that it did not have necessarily in Paul's time. For example, for those who say we can't participate in government, right, because of some sort of Anabaptist tendencies, perhaps, you say, well, what about the DMV, right? The DMV is part of the government. What about, firemen? What about the postal service? What about
school teachers,
healthcare, school teachers, so on and so on and so on, right?
I don't go down that road. Yeah.
So, another thing that Pastor Brian said reminded me of Origen, some of the early church fathers. And listen, I don't try to pretend that all these fathers were pacifists. Were just war folks. They just weren't. Many of them were some sort of pacifist. But what's interesting was Origen took a view that kind of reminds me of Aquinas, where Origen's responding to Celsus, who Celsus says, wouldn't it be a horrible thing if everybody became Christians, because then we would just be swamped by the barbarians because they want to join the military. And what Origen said is, he said, well, no, we are a priestly army, so to speak. I mean, we pray for the emperor. We pray for his armies. We pray for them to have bravery in their wars, but we don't fight them for the emperor. Right? So there's that, and Thomas Aquinas says that priests ought not, because of their sacramental duties, to partake in war. But that doesn't mean that Christians can't, right, wholesale.
Well, what it meant was, for Origen, was that he took war as a given, and he would pray that it would turn out the best it could for human flourishing, but that Christians would not participate in, because we're just something other. We're something other. And that's pretty radical these days to think that way. But that's where the early church was, and that's more or less where I land, admitting that it becomes complicated. All right, so you're willing to work for the DMV, but you're not willing to go kill on behalf of the state. Yeah, something like that. Something like that. And I think I would be careful about being too rosy about. I mean, I want to think well of America. I mean, it's my home. It's where I live. I don't know. Our history's pretty checkered. We have good PR, but you start digging into it and you see the shenanigans of the CIA around the world all throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. And it's like, that seems pretty beastly to me, actually.
I think probably at moments in this conversation, some of our listeners and viewers will be wanting to shout at you, Brian, and maybe at you at points, Andrew. And they will say, look, I mean, in the UK, we've just had Remembrance Sunday, and we remember those who fought for our freedom
here in America.
And yesterday, Veterans Day. And there is sort of two arguments here. One is that they fought for our freedom. And I suppose to sort of cast certain Western countries in this sort of imperial vein is maybe not to recognize the sort of the freedoms we have as citizens that are not held elsewhere. But also this issue of self-defense as well is maybe an important argument against, or common criticism of, the pacifist position. So in terms of those two things, the sort of justification of freedom and self-defense, what do you make of those arguments, Brian?
I'm very suspicious of the word freedom. That is way too abstract, and especially the way it's actually used in American discourse. I make the case that ultimately, if you really start digging, you realize that freedom is the power to kill, and I have talked to a lot of men who have been in combat. The reason I've talked to them is they reach out to me because of my books, and I will tell you that when in actual combat, men do not fight for an abstract concept of freedom. They fight for their brother right beside them. It's as simple as that. And I understand that. And that's where heroism can be present. And that's where all kinds of things that are genuinely noble can occur. But they're not, when the bullets fly, they're not thinking about abstract concepts of freedom. They're thinking about their friends and brothers on either side of them. I think I'll let Andrew respond to that. But the idea of freedom, I mean, the way we're using that word, Jesus doesn't seem to endorse that, because that's exactly what everybody wanted. This is Barabbas. Barabbas wasn't a serial killer. He wasn't a common murderer. He was, depending on your point of view, a freedom fighter or a terrorist. If you're Roman, he's a terrorist, an insurrectionist. If you're a zealot, a Jewish zealot, he's a freedom fighter. People wanted a Messiah that would fight for freedom And Jesus refused to do that. That Jesus, in fact, didn't see anything that involved killing other people as some form of freedom. And so that's where I land on that.
Andrew, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this idea that, Jesus, everyone wanted freedom, but Jesus didn't give it to them. He went to the cross with this path of non-resistance. What would you make of that kind of argument? Is freedom is the defense of freedom a good justification for war?
Yeah, I'd agree with some of Pastor Brian's concerns is that freedom is just such an abstract concept. I want to concretize it, right? So I think that Jesus came for a specific purpose within salvation history. I don't think that he came to launch a zealot movement, and I want to keep that contextually within salvation history. Now, as far as the idea of freedom and self-defense as a whole, listen, there's a passage in Exodus that people often use to justify self-defense, and I think a case can be made for self-defense. I also think, though, in many instances, you should run away. I mean, if you have the opportunity to run away without having to kill somebody, run away. Your life is not worth losing over a wallet. Cancel the credit cards on your phone when you get home. Run away if you can, right? That's the advice that I would give in many circumstances. You don't have to take a life. I'm reminded of J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, where there's a quotation in the Hobbit movie where it says, "True courage is not knowing when to take a life, but when to spare one," right? That is what's courageous. At the same time, I've done a lot of work recently on slavery and the history of slavery, specifically in Latin America. And I had the privilege of attending a human rights seminar recently, and we talked about slavery. And the truth of the matter is that the British Navy patrolled the open seas trying to catch slavers and trying to put an end to slavery. And so I think about that use of force, it was that use of force morally justified? And I think, yes, the abuses of slavery were awful. It was awful what happened. And so I think that in certain humanitarian situations that the use of force is justified. And one more pop culture reference that I would give for people to think about this was there was another Superman movie that came out this year. I know we have too many of them already, but there was another one. And I thought the most powerful scene in that whole movie was when Superman was talking to Lois Lane about his actions recently to prevent a war. And she was grilling him, and then he finally got to the point. He said, people were going to die. When we're talking about war, we're talking about heavy matter. We're talking about death here. And it's very hard for me to look at what happened in places like Rwanda, to look at what happened in slavery in Latin America and America, and to say that we shouldn't have used force, that there were other measures. I think we certainly should have used other measures, but that if we could use force and if it was proportional, it would be justified in using it.
Yeah, let me respond by backing up. I'm going to go back to freedom for a second, because this is the word that's used all the time. The American soldiers died for our freedom. Well, here's my question. Did the, 50-some thousand American soldiers who died in Vietnam, did they die for our freedom? I mean, we lost the war, and I feel pretty free. See, that's that kind of rhetoric that is used, because the one thing you have to do is assure people that they did not die in vain. But what if they did? What if they did? And I think that's, we have to face that. I mean, did the soldiers that died in Iraq die for our freedom? No, but they died anyway. But we continue to use that language because the one thing that we cannot allow to happen is to say they died in vain. But sometimes they just die in vain. They die for stupidity. They die because of the hubris of political leaders. And that's when I think the church needs to be a prophetic witness and say, no, we're not going to do that. Which, by the way, is what led to the rise of evangelical dominance in American political theology. Because what happened was, from the very beginning, the Christian church in America, though not a state church, did fulfill the role of chaplaincy for the nation. And what is the role of the chaplain in what I'm talking about here? It is to assure, to get young men to go to war is not hard, okay? I mean, they'll do that. They have visions of glory, and they're 18 years old, and they want to prove themselves. It's not hard to get young men to go to war, but what you have to do is assure mom and dad that if Johnny comes home in a body bag, that he didn't die in vain, that God was on our side, that God was blessing that. And that's what the church does. It blesses these wars. I mean, to the extreme that you see in Russia, you see the Orthodox priests sprinkling holy water on the tanks. And what became the mainline church in America did that throughout American history until Vietnam. And then much of the mainline church had qualms about this. I'm not so sure that we can bless this war. This doesn't seem to make sense. And they hesitated, and that's when the evangelical church said, well, we'll do that. We're fighting communism. We're going to stop the spread. I mean, if South Korea falls, or if Vietnam falls to communism, then the dominoes are going to fall, and pretty soon we're all going to be. Well, it didn't happen that way, but that's what opened the door for the evangelical church to be what it is today, the de facto state church of America. As far as the British patrolling and trying to get rid of slavery, I see that as a police function. I'm all for that. And did there have to be a war in which 750,000 people, 20% of men of fighting age from the South, died in the Civil War? Was that the only way that could have happened? I just refuse to believe that was the only way that slavery could have been ended. I mean, it did. That's the way it went. But because the South was convinced that God was on their side, I promise you, the vast majority of the South in the Civil War was convinced they were fighting a just war. And it was the South that was the more religious. It was the South that was more devout. It was the South that was more overtly Christian. And that's the problem with just war, is that you can justify all kinds of unjust wars. Yeah. And I mean, I know Andrew more or less agrees with that, but I'm saying this is the problem.
I agree, like Pastor Brian Gass, with a lot of what he said. I don't think the role of just warriors is to play cover, for whoever is Caesar during their time. I think that if you are truly bound, your conscience is bound to the principles of just war, then you ought to call out what you see as fouls. For example, if there are certain wars, like I'm afraid that my country is about to go to war with Venezuela, okay? If I can be honest, all right? We don't need that right now. So there are questions right now about the War Powers Act. There are questions right now about legitimate authority. I mean, can a president just claim Article 2 power and launch a war without an official declaration from Congress? That's a question that many legal folks are asking right now, but not just legal folks, but everyday people. This will have consequences for everyday people. So I agree with Pastor Brian, and I'm reminded in the early years of the church of Ambrose, who stood up to the Roman emperor, who brutally massacred his own people. I think it was about 6,000 people, and he denied him entry to the church. He said, you cannot come here for what you did. And I think that needs to be the role of just warriors like me in saying, you know what? We're not going to fight this war for you. So I think what is strange in this country is that we make exceptions for people who are principled pacifists, right? We have conscientious objectors. But what about selective objection, conscientious objectors? So like if I, for example, am a just warrior and I say, you know what? This war smacks to me of being unjust. It's interesting that although I fall within the dominant religious view of Christian engagement with violence as a just warrior, I would be denied exemption in my country. And I think that we should seek to make room for people like that who say, you know what, I think this war you're just about to draft me into is unjust. This goes against my religious conscience, and we should have room for folks like that.
And I agree. I agree 100%. But here's my problem. Andrew, you're a doctoral student at St. Andrews. Are we going to expect 18-year-olds to think as sophisticated about this? I mean, did the average 18-year-old Lutheran boy conscripted into the German army in the 1930s and 40s think they were fighting an unjust war? I don't think they did. I think they really thought that in theory, I agree with what you're saying, but as it plays out in real life, I think very few people have the wherewithal, have enough information, enough sophistication of thought to be able to think that way. That's why I really believe that the default position of the church should be the waging of war is incompatible with following Christ. Could there be moments when there are rare exceptions? Okay, I'll leave the door open for that. But the default position needs to be that the waging of war is incompatible with following Christ, because if that is not your default position, then I think everything else just falls apart. It's just too easy to recruit those to wage an unjust war.
So I have a question for you, because I think that we've passed this back and forth. I think that a lot of times what can be classified as war, others might look as policing function. So in this globalized age, when we have international treaties, when we have, for example, I don't think it was a good intervention, but in Libya, President Obama and certain NATO members, they invoked the responsibility to protect, and China and Russia abstained from the UN Security Council vote, and so they went in there. So in an age of globalization, in an age of international organizations, do you think that interventions in country is more of a policing function than what we would previously describe as a war?
Ideally. That's how I'm going to respond. Ideally. I mean, I leave room for that, yeah.
Yeah, my only...
But I mean, so understand that I am not one who has said... I mean, I've never said no one can join the military. I've never tried to talk someone out of that, except I regularly receive letters and emails and other forms of communication from career military people who have left the military because of the influence I've had on them through primarily my books. One of the more dramatic ones was a CIA officer in Afghanistan directing drone strikes on suspected terrorist hideouts, who also was reading A Farewell to Mars, and went to his commanding officer and said, I can't do this anymore. But interestingly, left the CIA, but went to the FBI and is now involved in counter-espionage in the United States and with the FBI. So he didn't completely leave the government, even the intelligence, but he just wasn't going to direct drone strikes anymore.
So Brian, do you think there is room for the individual conscience on these issues? The Sermon on the Mount, the pacifism of the Sermon on the Mount, is that a command to Christians, or do you think it's an invitation to live more in the fullness of what it means to be a human being, a Christian?
I don't think the Sermon on the Mount can be lived as individuals. I think the pressure's too great. You have to belong to a community that is committed to trying to follow these mandates from Christ. I think if we just leave it up to the individual, I mean, yes, I do leave room for conscience, but I don't think that's how the Sermon on the Mount should be approached. Rather, it is something we do together as a community.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the anti-Nazi theologian.
Yeah.
He was training ministers at this sort of, I think, secret camp at Finkenwalde.
And underground seminary,
Yeah, and there, I think in the life of Bonhoeffer, you see the complexities of these issues because, on the one hand, he's a kind of triple agent who's involved in a kind of ring which went on to try to assassinate Hitler. On the other hand, his own ordinands are, coming to him and going off to fight, and he's not exactly blessing it, but he is praying for them and he's having those pastoral conversations. But he thinks that this ethic of the Sermon on the Mount has to be lived out in community. I suppose that raises the next question, which is, how is this to be done? If pacifism, if we want to call it that, is not passivism, what is the positive approach to being a peacemaker? I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on that. Maybe starting with you, Brian.
Well, we have to begin by there's no such thing as an angry peacemaker. So I pray daily, Lord, make me a peaceable voice for peace in a nation that is given to the ways of war. And so it begins, first of all, by becoming a peaceable person. And that's where the emphasis lies. And that then we become it'll play out at all kinds of levels. If you put me in charge of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I wouldn't know what to say. And I'm very informed. And I mean, I've been to Gaza, and I've been these places, and I can tell you names of Israelis I know and Palestinians I know, and I don't have an answer. I cannot draw up a plan that I think would actually work. And so this is where I think we just simply have to point people to the way of peace in the person of the Prince of Peace, who is Jesus Christ. And others may pursue grand policies and strategies, and God bless them. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that's just way beyond me. And so my emphasis on being a peacemaker is to become a peaceable person myself, not cultivating anger or hatred or resentment, even towards those that I think are doing things that are very wrong and very terrible and very destructive, to still learn how to love my enemy and to pray for them and to bless them, and then to help others do the same. That may sound utopian, that may sound idealistic, that may sound, maybe the better word is naive, but I don't know any other way to approach it.
In terms of your own sort of pastoral situation, though, we often go to church and we hear "love your enemies." It sounds like this lovely thing. I mean, how do we actually cultivate the love of our enemies in our daily lives? In terms of, are there certain spiritual
you get to know them, you hear their story. I mean, an enemy oftentimes is someone whose story you have not yet heard, and that's why it's so easy to kill when we are fighting what we imagine is two-dimensional evil, just evil, rather than our weapons are pointed towards people that have a story, that have a history, that have arrived where they are through a whole series of events that is far bigger than they are. And if situations were reversed, I might just be on that very same side. I might be right where they are, the one that I call my enemy and hate. All I have to do is tweak a few little circumstances, and I'm that person. And I think we help people see that.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah. I think that through Christian discipleship, we need to instill in Christians that violence shouldn't be the first resort automatically, right? This is why one of the principles of the just war criteria is last resort. And I don't think in history that's been taken seriously. I think that there's been a history of mistrust between nations, especially with technological advancement. You would think it would get easier, but it hasn't. I mean, in ages past, armies moved on foot. And so ambassadors can move on horseback and they can get faster. But within the technological age, we're just trigger happy. In my time, the Pastor Brian talked about drone strikes, for example. I mean, some folks just get too trigger happy. But I think that we need to take just peacemaking seriously. I think we need to look at arbitration. I think that, for example, the Iraq War, I mean, there should have been more time afforded to the UN folks to do their job, right? But they weren't given sufficient time. So I think that when we're talking about just war, we need to understand this is not just legal positivism. As far as for me, it's theological reflection. It's theology made practical. Augustine would say that this is done from foremost from charity, all right, for love of enemies as well as love of neighbors. I know the love of enemies might be hard for people. How can you love your enemy when you're killing? And I admit that is hard, but Augustine talked about harsh benevolence, and that correcting an individual can be a means of loving them, or restraining them from committing evils could be a way of loving them. And I think there is some truth there. But I want to say, especially to people who are in America, that again, violence should not be our first resort. And I see many young people who think, now's the time to raise the barricades. Now's the time to overthrow this tyrannical regime. And again, invoking last resort, there are procedures that as a citizen of the United States, you still have open to you. You still have the courts open to you. You still have participation through the vote. So it would not be a legitimate exercise of force at all for tomorrow for you to necessarily erect barricades. So violence isn't always the answer.
I would say, I would never describe myself as a just warrior. I'm just not. But I would say to Andrew, may your tribe increase. because this is what Andrew is describing doesn't describe me, and doesn't reflect really what my theology is. But I say, may your tribe increase, because it is infinitely better than maniacal militarism, which seems to be on the rise in America and other places around the world.
And one more thing, because I read Pastor Brian's book, Farewell to Mars, leading up to this, which was a terrific book. If you could buy any book on just war and peace, pacifism, buy Pastor Brian's book, okay? But he has a section in there about Dwight Eisenhower that I've constantly thought about. I mean, America spends more money on war than the next 10 nations combined, last time I checked. And as Dwight Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex, this is
Dwight Eisenhower, we're talking here.
Dwight Eisenhower,
Mother Teresa.
We could use this on schools. I mean, we could use this to feed the poor. So it just baffles the imagination, this obsession with war. Like I said, I don't like war. I don't own a gun, for example. I hate war. I pray constantly over what's going over in Gaza and Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think the job of the church in moments like these is to speak truth. Vladimir Putin is a thug.
Mm-hmm.
We need to speak truth to power. And we need to install charity in Christ's disciples, so that, like Pastor Brian also mentioned before, many people have this notion that soldiers, for example, when they're in the heat of battle, they're motivated by hatred for the enemy. And that's true for many folks, but oftentimes they're motivated by self-preservation to stay alive and to try to keep their companions alive. So I think that, we have a job ahead of us in terms of Christian discipleship on these matters.
One final question for you, Brian. You've written a book called How Beauty Will Save the World. So I wonder, is there a place for the aesthetic imagination in terms of this non-violent approach?
Well, the basic thesis of that book is that we have the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. The church has leaned into Christian apologetics, defense of the truth of Christ. They've leaned into Christian ethics, that is defining the good in the light of Christ, but we've been pretty hit and miss on Christian aesthetics. And I would say that today, although I believe, there is a role for Christian apologetics and Christian ethics, I certainly believe that. I think, though, if we take our stand in the marketplace of ideas and say something like, we have absolute truth and we know what is good for you, and we meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings, we're going to be met with profound, at best, shoulder-shrugging indifference. So instead, what we may need to lean into is beauty, because beauty has a way of sneaking past our defenses. Can we enact beautiful lives? And I say the form of beauty is the cruciform, and so that the church should be present in the world, not with the clenched fist of rage or the wagging finger of shame or the pointing finger of accusation, but with arms outstretched in proffered embrace. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's the beauty that will save the world.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to end. Thank you again to my guests, Brian Zahnd and Andrew Hronich, for such a rich, thought-provoking discussion. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Brian's book, Farewell to Mars. You can also pre-order his forthcoming book, Unseen Existences, and subscribe to his Substack. Equally, do check out Andrew's fascinating work on universalism, particularly his book, Once Loved, Always Loved. If you've enjoyed today's show, please share it, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and consider supporting our work at premierunbelievable.com. Let us know what you thought of this discussion at unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Until next time, I'm John Nelson, and you have been watching and listening to Unbelievable.